trying out all the camera angles this week. So last week my video only got, not last week, the week before when I spoke about death, my video only got about 7 views. And the podcast wasn't that successful. So this week we're going to talk about the disposability of man and how we're all going to die. So kids, so I've been doing a lot of thinking, as I usually do. It's something which I do on a regular basis. Sometimes I don't even notice that I'm doing it. I just start thinking. It's a curse. I'm trying to break the habit, but somehow that habit persists, that I have to do some thinking. It would be much easier, life would be much easier if I didn't think. If I just did things. If I just ignored the thoughts within my... Granted, I'd struggle to walk. I don't know if that comes under thinking. Maybe that's involuntary. That's muscle memory. Remembering how to walk and talk and kind of get along with the world. But, life would be, they say ignorance is bliss. That would be fantastic. A little bit of ignorance. And occasionally I subject myself to a little bit of ignorance by distracting myself with things, projects, music, podcasts. And then we get a little introspective towards the end, and then I'm all of a sudden I'm thinking again. But, I have been thinking. So what have I been thinking about? Well, recently I've been reading Grayson Perry's book, The Descent of Man, which I picked up randomly off Amazon. I love Grayson Perry's work. Hands down one of my top 10 contemporary artists. I'd even probably say top 5. Admit that's because I'm out of touch with contemporary art, and he's quite prominent in the scene. But no, I love his work, and I loved the series he made where he just explored masculinity and identity. There's a great one where he made a vase and a painting and showed it to different men, and it was all about how they view themselves and masculinity and how it all intertwines. In his book, The Descent of Man, is a full exploration of this. It's a full exploration of what he refers to as the default man, and this whole idea of corporate executives and how they view their masculinity and how they compare themselves to other people and how people compare them and the effects that this all has, and how we as a society mix together and preserve default man whilst trying to be individuals, and it's been very interesting. I'm not even finished it. I'm like a chapter or 2 in, but it's one of those books where you pick it up and instantly you just start thinking about things, and these are things which I think about anyway. I've been wanting to do a podcast about masculinity and males for a while, but I never picked the right time. The last time I wanted to do this was when Chester Bennington committed suicide. And I wanted to do a podcast about male suicide and get involved with that. But at the same time, I didn't want to be seen as profiteering off male suicide. So I kind of drew it back and said, we'll ignore that for a little while, as society does with suicide. And we'll step back and we'll reconsider. But it got me thinking recently because I've been reading this book, and I thought it'd be a nice subject, not a nice subject, but a subject to roll around on a little bit. So this podcast is called The Disposability of Man. And the reason it is titled that is because I've been sat thinking about how, as a society, men are essentially labelled as disposable. They are people who have a lot of power and an unnecessary amount of power and are very privileged just by being born. But at the same time, there is a blank, you can get another feeling about them. They're very interchangeable with that sense. There's not a lot of identity to it. And part of that comes down to masculinity and dragging out personality traits and making everything kind of consistent in order to perpetuate the patriarchy, essentially. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, essentially, so you think, if you think as you've grown up as a male, a lot of what you might consider your identity is questioned by other people within the male gender, because when questioning something, you gain a little bit more power. If you just accept something, you gain nothing from it. So if you question something and can make someone question themselves, then you're gaining a little bit more power over them. So you can progress a little bit more, as in your social standing. And we'll get into that. I imagine we'll get into that. But the core idea I wanted to discuss. We're getting off point. We're already off point. It's been 6 minutes and we're already off point. Was this idea that men are disposable, and by that I mean that men don't feel. I could just leave it there. No, men don't feel like their lives have worth particularly. I don't know if that's a general statement for you to hear. I don't know if you agree with it. It is something which I have dealt with in my own life. Something which I still deal with in my own life on a day-to-day basis, that as a being that I'm insignificant. But then that's what drives me. That's something which I grasp onto and say, okay, I'm insignificant, therefore I need to try and make myself significant within my own view. But that's me. I'm able to separate what other people think of me and what I think of me, and basically I'm just trying to impress myself. But my standards for myself are quite high. He says, sat in his pajamas making a podcast at 4 in the afternoon. But there's this idea which we've pushed forward on young men, I think, and throughout life, that men are completely cannon fodder. We have this divide between genders, that women should be protected and looked after, and a lot of that comes down to the whole damsel thing and wanting to subjugate women, to make them more demure, and they should act like that, blah 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 blah, and all that toxic crap. But the flip side of that, of course, is that men should be strong, permanent, but at the same time be disposable. Because you can't have both. You can't have men who should be strong and brave and go to war without men who should die for the cause. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. This is a very complex topic, which is why I'm trying to stick to the disposability of man. Right in the middle there. If you can watch this on the video, I'm right in the middle. Just in the middle there. Be like the center of a jammed biscuit. And I was trying to think why this is. And as I say, a lot of it comes back to, but then I realised that a lot of what we have with this whole subject is heavily ingrained in everything, like literally everything which could be male related, or story related. So the one which jumped to mind was the TV trope of the hero dies, or the film trope of the hero dies. If you've watched any film or TV, at some point you will have seen a flick where the hero dies, right? That's just a truth. The huge example, Lord of the Rings. Gandalf dies. Boromir dies. They are people who sacrifice themselves for the cause. Now, I got thinking about that, and I was thinking, hang on a minute. That happens way too often in films. The amount of times that a male sacrifices themselves for the greater good is numerous. So much so that when I googled protagonists who die or protagonists who sacrifice themselves, it wouldn't let me search themselves because there wasn't enough search results. It would only let me search himself, which, that's the TV, that's the trope, that's the idea that within media, we have basically been told that if you are a male protagonist and there is a situation where somebody will need to die, you are going to die. It's as clear as day as the black guy dies first. That's the adage. The hero dies. If you are a male protagonist, your job is to be there to sacrifice yourself should that moment come. You can't solve things. Don't try and solve things. Just go there, die for the cause. Everyone else will survive. You'll die for the cause. And then the adage of that is that because in the view of media that the black man is even less important than the white male protagonist, that they will die first. And they won't solve the situation. They'll just die for the cannon fodder of it. Getting hugely controversial there. So I did a bit of Googling. And I found a list on something called Ranker.com, which I didn't even know existed, of best fictional characters who sacrifice themselves. And I'm going down this list, and I'm not saying that women don't sacrifice themselves in films. Obviously, Ellen Ripley jumps to the top of the list in terms of people who have sacrificed themselves to save others. But this list, it's just guys. It's like 90% guys. It's large groups of men just killing themselves to save someone. And that's a very strange message. And I got thinking about it as kids, if you needed to, you never leave a man behind. That's a key phrase. But at the same time, everyone you watch in films, generally, there'll be a person they respect will die for everybody else if the situation leads to that. And that is a very strange message to give to children. That is a very strange message to give to young men. And that is a very strange message to give to society as a general. Like a general point that your purpose in a dire situation is to die. And men are so ready to sacrifice themselves. Completely ready to sacrifice themselves. Step in front of the other person to get shot, to get stabbed, to die. That the self-preservation clause in the back of their head just completely voids, because for their entire lives they've been told, no, if there's a situation where people are going to die, you are going to die, you are going to end up on the list. If we go to war, conscription kicks in, males are going to be taken. That is the way of society. That is what you think. And it rolls on further than that. I know a lot of people, especially young males, and this is why, I have my own views on the army anyway, but there's this whole cultural idea which kind of stems from young males who feel disenfranchised and don't feel like they have anything going in their life. And literally, this is the advert for the army. There's a guy, mid-20s, working in a pub, doesn't really know what he wants to do with his life, so joins the army. That's literally in one of the trailers. And this idea that you can kind of take this whole generation and say, okay, well, you haven't achieved anything by the time you're 20, so surely you should join the army, right? You should join the army. It'll give you discipline. You'll also die for your country. So you have this whole rift of men who believe that their only purpose in life is to sacrifice themselves, that the only worthwhile thing that they could put into their world is their death. And that's a hugely saddening point. That your sons and fathers likely have the idea in their heads, overriding a lot of their decision within life, that their purpose in life is to die. There's nothing else they feel like they can offer. And that, to me, is something which I'm kind of like, it's such an idea which completely stops me in my tracks when I think about it, because that means there's a whole world out there of adults who are just waiting for it, looking for that reason. And I think that couples with male suicide, that we see ourselves as disposable. And we always have done, because that's what you've always been taught. That's the message we are given from birth. Well, not from birth. I mean, you don't come out of the womb and they go, you know what, you're going to die at some point. I mean, we're all aware we're going to die, but why should our role models all be the people who die too? Why should the people we are given to view as these are important characters all be people who are looking to die instead of people who are trying to use their intelligence? We're told as kids, I mean, this is one which always comes up so the message is generally boys are told not to cry, and then we wonder about why the male suicide rate is so high. Now, I don't vividly remember being told not to cry. I don't think my dad ever told me not to cry. He used to question why I cried. And I did cry quite a lot as a child. And I think that's a better way of doing it, because it wasn't something which... It taught me... This is going to sound quite strange, I imagine. So the way it kind of works is that if you tell a boy not to cry, then obviously they repress their emotions, repress their expression, and then kind of bottle it, don't know how to deal with it or anything like that. Whereas I was questioned why, and that comes down a lot to my own personality, my dad's personality, of just questioning things and making you think about the logic of things. So when I was crying and it would be for no reason, of something quite minute, he'd question why I was crying, and then that would trigger in me something to go, okay, I need to think about this. I need to think why I'm having this emotional reaction, which made it very easy for me to deal with, dealing with the rifts of life. But then that's the thing. So you kind of sat there going, well, why is the male suicide rate so high? And so why wouldn't it be so high at this point? Why wouldn't it be at the state it is? Because every person who has ever been brought into the world who classifies as male has been told, no, within our society, you're not that important. And I think that, again, couples with this whole idea of male competitiveness and the masculine toxicity. Is that, we're overly competitive as a gender. We're fully ingrained in the fight to succeed, and it's because succeed means survive. The higher up the tier you are, the less disposable you are, and of course that's not completely true, and it's not something which gives you complete happiness, because you get to the top and then suddenly you realize you haven't got anything else, because the way you got to the top is not healthy or helpful to society, and it all kind of weirdly links together and just generates this kind of cesspool of disposability of mankind and men. And I think that's something which, as males, we need to think about. And we need to think about the representations you give to your children and teenagers of, your purpose is to die. Your purpose is to sacrifice yourself. If you are going into the army, it should be the males who die. And I know a lot of this comes back to, the whole idea that women are life givers, protectors, and that kind of thing. But I don't think that needs to be the case. We aren't in a situation where we're in dire straits, where half the population's being wiped out, where, plagues are taking out every city, where we've got imperialistic armies trunching across mountains and fjords to come kill us. We haven't got any of that, because our society is in one of the most peaceful times of our entire lives. So it's just not necessary anymore. The only time that I imagine that could be necessary is if we had an alien invasion, because I don't think any society is going to get to a point where they can get to the scale which would be needed to take over the rest of the world without the rest of the world reacting, because we're so interconnected. And I'd love to get into a room with any. Well, I don't even get into a room. I just want. So let's say if you work in the media industry, right, or you're writing a book, or you're writing a film. When you sit there and you think of those things, and you think of, right, okay, we need this storyline, and this is going to be tragic, and we've got this guy who's doing this, blah 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 blah. When you think of the end point of that character, just sit there and question whether that person needs to die. Whether they really need to die. Does it actually add anything to the story? I'm not saying the person can't get injured, because the trope comes one, from lazy writing. Just going to throw that out there. One, the trope of the male character dying and the hero dying is just lazy writing. Not always. Sometimes it's good, but it's the sacrifice that they finally found peace. And it's because you don't know how to end your story. Because you don't know how to reconcile that thing and that emotion. I think one fantastic example of that being subverted is in Constantine with Keanu Reeves, where, for all intent and purposes, that guy should have died. according to the trope. He gets to the end of the film, commits suicide. The world carries on. There's you know, Rebecca Weiss sat there at the end, carries on living. She could have mourned him. It would have been beautiful in the trope world, but no, they brought him back. They brought him back to deal with what happened, because all of a sudden, wanting to die wasn't the goal anymore. All of a sudden, reached that point and then brought it back. Reached that point of everything's lost and we're all hopeless and we're going to burn in eternity, and then brought it back. Brought it back. And you can do that. You can do that. And that is such a better message for the world, don't you think? That's such a message where you can sit and go, okay, right, so well, looks like all hope is gone. We're damaged, we're bruised, we're missing limbs. Pretty sure some people have only got half a face at this point in time. Society is destroyed. But this one last person doesn't need to die. Just saying. That ignition trigger doesn't need to be triggered on by a human being now. It's a trope. It is a complete trope of everything. But it's a trope which has ingrained our society and reflects what we think in society. You know? You die to sacrifice yourself and save your family and your friends and protect the cause or the country or whatever, and that's what you're told when you're completely young. So when you get depressed and you think about the things which affect you in your life, you don't feel any worth. You don't sit there and think, oh well, I guess I'm worth something. You don't. You sit there and think, well, maybe I should join the military, because if I die, I've done something. I'm worth something. Then that's my cause. That's a point which I can kind of put forward and say, yeah, I did something. And rather than just knowing that your actual existence is worth something, that there's completely untapped potential for you to exist within the world and do something. And even if you went through your entire life and got to old age and you hadn't particularly achieved in what you view as achieved, that's not a bad thing, because you've existed and interacted and participated within society. At some point, you didn't need to die to kind of solidify your place. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make here. That you don't need to hurt yourself and take yourself out of the equation to be significant. And I think that's a huge part of, of what male suicide is about. In order to feel significant, the only way one of the ways which they've been taught or pushed upon is that if you die, then you're worth something, because that's the mission. That's the purpose in life. I don't know if you'd agree. I don't know if the world would agree, and maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I think everything's a bit too interlinked. It could be because I've been overthinking it after reading Descent of Man. I think, and I don't think this has anything to do particularly with masculinity, this one spectacle point. I think this is just something which as a society that was agreed upon and has become the consistent norm to tell the world. And I think that's because, like, the whole, trying to explain myself. So the thing with masculinity is obviously that masculinity is perpetuated by males, because it is something which as a gender is agreed upon, essentially, or not agreed upon, but at least forced upon people. Whereas this isn't something which is just male. This is something which affects all genders, and I think as a society is decided and accepted in a way, which is the other weird thing, that the amount of times you see different characters and whatnot just so willing to let this happen, so willing to let young men sacrifice themselves and kill and use life as a disposable achievement. And that's That's insane. You know? It has to be insanity. That can't just be me staring at the wall and thinking, well, how is that society's view? Why can't that change? And I'm not saying we need to stop making stories about heroes, and I'm not saying we need to stop telling stories about people who did sacrifice themselves. Those are important stories, and those are important sacrifices, and being martyred and you know, dying for a cause is a huge sacrifice to make. And I don't want anyone to misinterpret this as me besmirching anyone who has done that. All I'm saying is that doesn't need to be the go-to norm, because the mass effect of rolling that on into everything else is hugely damaging. And I think anyone who has struggled or does struggle with themselves and their self-destruction and self-worth just needs to consider that they are worth something. You are worth something. We're all worth something. And we're worth much more when we're here. Killing yourself, sacrificing yourself do not need to be the end point. They do not need to be the point where you look to as a goal, as an achieve. You know, that doesn't need to be there. And I know that's a very hard thing to accept when everyone else is telling you that that's the purpose. That's how you do it. That's how you be a real man. That's how you succeed within your society, is to put yourself on the line for that ultimate sacrifice. That doesn't need to be the way. I'm hoping I explained this in a clear way, but there's a chance I've rambled. It's a big subject, and it's a complex subject. But I'd love to know what you think, because I'd love to know how you view yourself, how you view other people within this framework, whether you've had anyone who has felt this way and has come round, or was sadly lost, and whether you think this is something which we can change. I'd like to see more stories of heroes surviving, dealing with struggle, dealing with sacrifice, but at the same time persevering, because that's what we do as the human race. We struggle, we survive, we persevere, and then we die, when the time's right. Not just for a cheap plot point. I'll talk to you guys later.